What's up, bro? It's your boy Mike Muse from the episode of the Mike Muse Show. I'm so excited to be in conversation with the next guest. Listen, people always talk about New Year, New Me. Everybody always has these great resolutions, and it always starts with, I don't know, starting a company, starting a business, losing weight, the whole nine. FYI, I've been telling people 2021 is going to look exactly like 2020, but I think 2021 has proven itself that they are even more complicated than what 2020 gave us. And I'm not the guy who does New Year's resolutions. That's just not part of my bag. Like, I stopped making resolutions like years ago, right? And so I'm not a resolution kind of guy, but I know health is always on everyone's mind at the top of the year. But in particular this year, health is definitely on people's minds due to all the reasons that doesn't need to be restated here. I want to introduce you, Dr. Marvin Singh. What's happening, Doc?
Hi, thank you for having me on the show. And just like you, I also don't believe in New Year's resolutions.
But you have something really interesting. You have a clinic called Precision Medical Clinic. Talk to me a little bit more about it.
The premise of precision medicine is it's not like you come through the clinic and you have a question, you get an answer, and that's the end of the story. That's kind of how a regular doctor's office might work. And the whole point here is to help you understand how to live your life, to live longer, healthier, and be happier with your circumstances and your life and your environment and your job. And that's not an on or off switch. We want to live for a long time. And so we want to follow you for your life. And what we're doing here is a little bit different in the approach. Precision medicine means a lot to some people. Like, you go get your cholesterol checked, you get some labs checked, you get a stress test, an EKG, and, doctor says you have a clean bill of health. But I don't know how many people but I've seen plenty of people get that, quote unquote, clean bill of health and then, be in the emergency room 6 months later with their first major heart attack. So I really take a different approach in that we want to try to learn as much about your body from a vantage point that is unique, that most people don't really look for on a regular basis, and then try to understand what your personalized risks are for certain things.
Talked about what technology are you guys using that makes it more precise, right? Like more accurate.
Right. So some of the things we'll look at they're on multiple different levels. So we'll look at your genes. We can sequence your whole genome. So look at all the DNA in your blood and give you an idea of understanding what your genetic risks are. We'll use stool samples and look at your microbiome, because the gut microbiome is really an ecosystem of trillions of microorganisms, primarily bacteria, that can give us a risk for autoimmune disease, chronic diseases, inflammation, you name it. And while these names sound like, it just sounds like a stool test, it's really not. There's so much technology behind these stool tests because they're using very sophisticated whole genome sequencing to do this. And AI is driving some of the evaluation of these reports. So while it may seem like, I did a stool sample and I got a 10-page report, there is so much power behind that, because in order to get to that report and understand what's happening with these microbes in your gut and what's happening with your genes, there's a ton of technology behind there.
We always hear about, your blood type, so we hear things about, based on your blood type, here's the food you should be eating, right? And I haven't done that, folks. I'm just saying that's one example that people use, medicine or biological data to assess what type of food you should be eating. Something that I saw about you that really stood out was you used an example of like your Achilles tendons, I believe. And what it was about was, through the precision medicine technique that you guys offer, you guys can determine, based upon genes and genetics, what type of exercise should be done, whether it's endurance, whether it's strength. And I find that to be fascinating. I haven't heard people talk about exercise, and exercise on everybody's mindset. Like, some people run and get results really faster by running. Some people lift. Some people do a combination of the two, but it's all trial and error. So talk to us about that. I think that will be a good example for our audience today to have a better understanding about how AI is used, right? And then what the output of practicality can look like. Because we've all exercised once before, and due to that exercise, we said no more.
Yeah, this is a very fascinating part. So there's a whole component of genomics called nutritional genomics. And basically, these are looking at the genes or sets of genes that pertain to nutrition and exercise. And so, yes, there are genes that will give us an idea of whether you would be more successful as a weightlifter or whether you're more successful as an endurance performer, and how you may feel mentally if you exercise a certain amount, how much you should exercise if you needed to lose weight, and what kind of foods you should eat potentially if you were want to help facilitate losing weight. And so, and as you mentioned, the Achilles tendon thing also. So certain people have a gene that would put them at risk for having an Achilles tendon injury. So if you know these things going into it, then I often will suggest, okay, well, it looks like, you would benefit from lifting weights. You should do cardio as well, but, get a trainer, talk to them about these gene results, and develop a personalized exercise program that can really help unleash the genetic power that you have in your DNA. But by the way, you have a predisposition to having an Achilles tendon injury. So make sure you also tell that to your trainer and protect your Achilles heel and warm up and cool down properly. Don't do any abrupt, running uphill type of maneuvers, because that might, increase your risk of having an injury. And where the technology comes in this is really, because a lot of companies can sequence your genes. I mean, the genes are just your information, your genetic information. That part has become easy. What makes things special when you're looking at a company is how are they taking that information that is in your genes and translating that to something that's going to be useful for you, information or recommendations. And so how they use AI and technology in this regards is they have these proprietary softwares that really search and sift through the research, and they find actual literature and data that support the recommendation. So they'll show that, okay, well, you have a predisposition to Achilles injury. And here's an article and here's an article that suggests that those people with this genetic mutation may have that problem. And so it's not just like, oh, well, maybe you'll have an Achilles injury. It's really based in science. And that's what I really like to follow. And that's what I look for when I'm, vetting tests and stuff to use on my patients.
Audience, insert here kind of background, just 30-second tutorial on AI. I'm gonna do my best I can in 30 seconds. What AI is, artificial intelligence, as you all know, is machine learning, which you guys have probably heard of, and it's called big data. So everything starts with big data. And so this example is the articles, it's the genomics, it's the genetics, it's all the research that's out there around those type of things. And then essentially the computer in that moment is learning and pulling all this data into one center, if you will. Then based upon like formulas and equations, is creating an output. And that's your artificial intelligence on best recommendations based upon what the machine is learning off of these data sets. And these data sets are being queued up essentially from articles and data and research around the world that's on the internet. So that's kind of the backdrop of how the science is happening kind of behind it.
Exactly. So that's just, and I was going to say, when you're looking at your whole genome, this is like an encyclopedia, volumes of encyclopedias worth of information. How do you make sense of it? How do you understand what's important, what's not important, and how important a genetic mutation is or not for you to worry about? Because there's thousands and thousands of data points. And so this is where, if you have a good company that has good AI behind their data collection, then you can understand their recommendations and implement them much more easily.
So I want to stick with this weight loss example, because I think this weight loss example is going to help. Because weight loss in exercise is something that every person can relate to in one capacity. So I want to just kind of zone in on this weight loss thing for one quick second before I start going out to other ways in terms of how this could be prescriptive when it comes to medicine and alternative medicine and all that kind of stuff, before we get into things that not everyone can relate to. So are you telling me that, through the Precision Clinic, through what you guys are doing, if I'm coming to you and say, hey, Dr. Singh, I really want to lose weight, right? Mm-hmm. Can you help me figure out, based upon genetics or whatever, the best type of weight loss program exercise wise that I need to be focused on?
Of course, of course. And the important thing to remember, though, it's not just about your genes. So that's what sometimes people get fixated on. Well, if I just do this gene test and I'll know my genes, then I'll be able to figure it out. Yes, the genes play an important role, but so does the microbiome. So does your sleep habits, your stress mitigation practices. So do a variety of different things, mitochondrial health. So my premise in Precision Clinic is to look at all of these things, then understand what your goals and priorities are, and then focus the recommendations based on your personalized information to help you achieve that goal.
Wow. Okay, so I'm signing up myself. I volunteered to be the first person to do this experiment live with you. I'm like your new influencer. Thank you. You didn't invite me. I'm completely volunteered myself. I'm excited for my first consultation because I want a six-pack. I want a six-pack by like April, right? So thank you, Dr. Singh. Audience, I'll update you on my six-pack evolution with Precision Clinic. So let's move on now because I want to get to actually the medicine aspect of it. Like, how can this have an impact with individuals who may have other, medical, we hear this word now, pre-existing conditions, right? Or for more dire medical situations, like maybe like diabetes or like cardiovascular disease, right? So it's like, if I have cardiovascular disease, like talk to me like how Precision Clinic can be a help to that, and how the technology can be a help to that.
I think the key is really in understanding what your personalized risks are. And if there is a particular gene or an issue that offers you a added risk, and there's a solution associated with that gene mutation, for example, that you might not ordinarily know about, then follow that solution, because the reflexive answer for a lot of these things is, oh, well, you should eat healthy, you should exercise and, eat plants, okay, well, I mean, that's kind of a good general broad, recommendation, but how many people have tried to do that and really didn't make it very far? There's a lot more to health than just what it seems to be on the surface. And Alzheimer's disease is actually a good example we could use. So if somebody's concerned about Alzheimer's disease, like say their mom had Alzheimer's disease and they're concerned that they might get Alzheimer's disease. So what we can do, number one, is look at your genes, see if you actually have genetic risk. And then we can also look at some of the factors that cause or contribute to Alzheimer's disease, like, your exposure to toxins, whether you have leaky gut, how inflamed or imbalanced your microbiome is. Then we can take that information and combine it with actual imaging of your brain. That is not just regular brain imaging, but really high level brain imaging where we can measure certain volumes of your brain and give you a very personalized risk. So for example, if you say, I'll use a real life example. So I had a patient who had a family history of Alzheimer's disease, was really concerned about it. And we did this whole gamut of testing on them. And yes, they did have a gene for Alzheimer's disease, which we give them, I think about a 25% risk, increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. But looking at their brain imaging, we see that everything looks great. And they were already in their 60s. So if you looked in the literature and in the textbooks and you see that, oh, well, this gene mutation is associated with 25% increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, for example, that's a population-based response. That's what everybody's going to tell you, because anybody can check this specific one gene. But then when you look at their imaging, you say, well, while the population-based risk for this gene might be 25%, your actual personal lifetime risk over the next, 8 or 10 years might be half that amount, for example. Yeah. And by the way, we see that you have these toxins floating around in your body. And we see that your microbiome is a little imbalanced here. We see that you have risk for cardiac disease because our imaging shows this and your cholesterol shows this. Let's tweak this, tweak that, clean this up, clean that up. And this is how you can work towards preventing a problem from occurring, or at least prolonging the onset of this thing to occur. And I think this is really a revolutionary
God damn, Dr. Singh,
of addressing health. This is how it's going to be done.
You're blowing me away because there's a lot of people who have members who have Alzheimer's, and I have dementia runs in my family, and so just and then there's always that wonder, that curiosity, and I've heard people close to me or other people who've had it say, "I wonder, am I predisposed to it?" And what does that mean? And so it's sounding like, through the use of AI and big data that you guys have been able to conjure up, you guys can help someone, if you're noticing it early, a pattern that can be detected. There's a certain type of prescriptiveness, not necessarily through drugs and medication, but prescriptiveness and tweaks that can be done to clean your body enough to rid yourself of less likelihood of coming on with onset of Alzheimer's. Now, talk to me a little bit about one more practical case before I get into policy aspect of it. What about if someone already has like a diabetes or cardiovascular? Talk to us about someone who already has it. How can precision and AI and big data facilitate that?
Well, I guess one of the things the basic concepts that we often don't talk about is, what is disease anyways? Where does it come from? Diabetes, for example, is basically, if you look at the medical definition, people think of it as, elevated blood sugar. But where does that come from, and why do people have these problems? It's related to chronic inflammation and your metabolism. Where does that come from? So when you dial it back, and you look for underlying causes that could be driving the problem, that's the real problem. When we can address those issues, then everything else may melt away. Yeah. So, for example, with diabetes, that diet is a large part of that. There could be a genetic risk. There may be toxins in that person's life that may need to be modified. There could be issues with how well their mitochondria, which are the energy powerhouses of the cell, are working. Their microbiome may be off balanced. All of these things can be utilized to understand what's going on, and then you can prescribe basically what their regimen should be using these sophisticated tests.
Amazing. Do you guys do prescriptions?
Prescription medications?
Yeah.
If somebody needs a prescription medication, so I guess that's a good point. I'm not like homeopathic, like I am allergic to prescribing medications. I'm an integrative medicine physician. Integrative medicine means that you use the best of both worlds. If somebody can benefit from prescription medication and that seems to be the best thing for them, then fine. We live in a sophisticated, civilized society with advanced technology. And so if some medication can be life-saving or really get you there, then we obviously don't want to rob you of that. But we want to also weigh the risks of certain medications against what could be perhaps another approach that may be just as effective or maybe even more effective. So,
do you guys can you guys run assessments on what the best medication that you should be taking for those who may need prescriptive medicine?
Well, that's a great question too, because some of these tests that we can do also involve what we call pharmacogenetics. So that means that I have access to a database where I can type in aspirin. And if I type it in and it's looking at your genes, and it may say, in this patient's case, aspirin may be less effective in preventing heart disease. Wow. If I type in Lipitor for cholesterol, it may say, well, Lipitor may not work so well in this patient's, if this patient has a cholesterol problem.
Okay, I get it. Genius, right? Genius, Dr. Say. Genius. Due to the time constraints, I got to rush along, and I hate it. That means you guys just come back and be the
I could talk forever on this stuff.
You're going to come back, and now I'm deeming you the unofficial integrated medicine expert for the Mike News Show. But the next thing is, let's talk about cost. And where is this costing, and does insurance cover this?
So that's a great question. Some things insurance will cover, and some things insurance won't cover. And I hope that with time that will change. That's not something I can control. That's something that the government really controls with what Medicare decides to cover or not. And then all the other insurance payers follow suit. A lot of times people will get coverage, even though it's not typically understood to be covered, when they submit to their insurance company, separately, and they may cover it as a kind of health preventive thing. It really depends on their plan. There's so many different plans these days. I'm very.
Let's speak very specific, right, for the audience, right? So let's use insurance companies that most average Americans have heard of, like Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, Cigna, right? So does this coming to your clinic, will those, and case by case basis, I know you can't answer all of the questions, right? Broad stroke, does your clinic cover that, or is it because you guys are considered preventative, then insurance does not cover that? If you can be more specific about that.
The problem is that insurance doesn't really care as much about preventative stuff. That's a problem with the way our healthcare system is set up. So we will help facilitate, you submitting a claim to your insurance company, but the clinic itself doesn't participate in insurance itself.
Got it. It's fair. And this isn't a knock to what you're doing, but we need to have honest answers, because then if that's the case, what I'm hearing, you may not be comfortable saying, and it's okay, it's no judgment here, is that you're out of pocket, right? And the services are expensive, and it's out of pocket. But what I'm gathering,
not necessarily expensive though. So that may be.
Yeah, well, out of pocket. But what that's saying, and my audience knows that the reason I love having conversations, because now we need to figure out what policies are associated, right? That needs to be fixed, right? And because of the fact that what you're doing is so amazing and brilliant and needed, and I'm just thinking about for all the populations that this type of service could be needed for, right? For the elderly populations. And now we're getting to the populations now where younger adults are now caring for their parents at a quicker rate than what it used to be, right? Marginalized communities with access to information. One, is this not out there? Two, coverage doesn't exist. Three, communities of color are so used to being prescribed a quick fix of medicine. It may not be the best medicine, but it's just like this lazy medicine. And also, two, most doctors and physicians don't hear the voice of people of color all the time, right? But like if there's data and there's science through AI that can be best prescriptive in that, then we need to have that conversation, right? And then we also need to have the conversation of like, well, then how do we start discussing preventative medicine of this type? Right, because this is more than just going to your gym and counting that as preventative health, right? But healthcare. This is, and you get reimbursed, from some insurance programs do that, right? But this is more than just a preventative thing. This is actually medicine technology integrated that's preventable, that could be cost saving, down the road. And so for me, the larger conversation is how do we fix that, right? How do we fix it as a society? How do we now, because we look at preventativeness, I never looked at preventative from an AI, what you're doing. So this is new to me, right? And it's new to my audience. And so how did we start having a larger conversation as a nation, policy-wise, to make sure that clinics like yours or other healthcare professionals who are doing this type of thing, particularly those from the University of Michigan, have their type of work integrated within this space. And my audience, I took them on the journey when I had my tooth experience and journey, and how it was emergency surgery and there was no way to save my tooth, but the astronomical cost that I had to pay out of pocket just because my insurance didn't cover it. And not that it didn't cover it, but that doctor wasn't even interested in taking insurance, right? For all the reasons that we know why some doctors just aren't interested in taking, insurance. But that just goes to a larger narrative of things that need to be fixed in our healthcare system. And if we don't have these type of personal stories like mine to illuminate that, it can never get fixed, right? If we don't have incredible doctors like you who are creating some really innovative tools that can help people of color, marginalized communities, right? People who are underinsured, right? And those who are underinsured and people of color have the most healthcare problems. And so this is why I would love to have a part 2 with you, Doc. I would love for you to come back on. Ladies and gentlemen, that's been my show. What a day, what a week, what a moment we're living right now in American history. So there's gonna be so much more to unpack throughout the week. Keep rocking with me. Lots to unpack, literally and figuratively. So next time, folks, that's the show. Peace.